Hey, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whenever you happen to happenstance into this Truth Bomb riff by Patrick Lovell, the muckraking journalist and producer of The Con at www.thecon.tv, now for free. In this particular Truth Bomb, I want to tackle a very controversial, sensitive, and uncomfortable subject to tackle. And I think it's extremely important given how this sort of scenario can be delegitimized, twisted, manipulated, or promulgated for a specific outcome, all of which are very difficult for someone like me to be able to contend with. So I think I just have to meet this like everything else I do head on. So the subject of today's Truth Bomb is anti-Semitism. The reason that I wanted to talk about it is because recently there's been a lot of stir, especially geared towards Bobby Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., regarding some comments that he made last week that were recorded by and posted by the New York Post, in which he had proclaimed that he had thought, based on a study that he had been engaged in, and I don't know all the details of what the study was, who actually created the study, for what purposes, and so forth. But his takeaway in this particular session, in fact, as I recall, one of the people, a woman, sitting next to him was agreeing with what he was saying wholeheartedly. And what he had said was that both the Chinese and, well, actually, let me back up. What he said was both whites and African Americans were targeted by COVID. And he said the study proclaimed something along the lines that I guess that percentage-wise, and I had no idea what the sample data was, that the Chinese and of all people Ashkenazi Jews were less impacted by COVID. I don't know, like everybody else, I heard this, his voice, what he did in something that he had said in a previously recorded engagement. So I didn't do the deep dive. I didn't study everything that I needed to know about this to get a full-on understanding and a grasp of whether or not Bobby Kennedy Jr. is actually anti-Semitic. But I can tell you that the reaction to that statement, particularly by somebody who I watch and I respect and I enjoy, is somebody who I think really does a fabulous job bringing very important revelations to the national dialogue all the time, although based on this and some other things that he's done recently, I'm not quite sure I've got, let's say, full faith in Lawrence O'Donnell and his ability to, be less, shall we say, emotionally inclined and connected to whatever Bobby Kennedy's situation is and his purpose, given really all things MSNBC's relationship towards Donald Trump and, of course, MAGA. So let me back up a little bit and give you some perspective on who I am and why I think this is extremely important for us to discuss. So my name is Patrick Lovell, and I'm Jewish. Now, my grandfather used to say, jokingly, that I was named after the Jewish mayor of Ireland. Interesting, or not of Ireland, of Dublin, sorry. Ireland would be a country, but of Dublin. And I found out, actually, one of my favorite bands of all time is U2. And I remember reading this biography of U2 and finding out that my background is not really too dissimilar to Bono's. I think his grandfather was also Jewish, and I'm not sure how it worked out with his mom. Maybe his mom was, but therein lies, the situation with me. My name is Patrick. My middle name is Stewart, with the last name Lovell. Lovell means the wolf, which is Old English. My father's side of the family goes back to 14th century England, and my father's side of the family is from both England and Germany, and they settled in Central Texas. And the German side of the family were like many immigrants from Germany in the late 1800s, early 1900s that settled in Central Texas. And most of them were Lutheran, as a matter of fact. And, farmers, hardworking, very stoic kind of people, if you will. And my grandmother on my father's side, she was Catholic initially and ultimately became a Christian Scientist and went back and forth because her husband, my father's dad, my grandfather, had returned from like 15 years of war in World War II and also in the Korean War, only to die in a drunk driving accident in Searchlight, Nevada. And she apparently went deep dive Christian Scientist after that experience. And eventually she settled again on Catholicism. And my dad's side of the family, all of my cousins, for the most part, are, I think, Catholic. I do know one of my cousins who, I grew up with these guys. They were like my brothers. One guy, I believe, played in a Christian rock band after a long time of, being in an industrial punk rock band for a long time. So I'm not sure what sort of Christianity he professed. But I know I felt, growing up my whole life, a little bit of a sort of strange, sort of dissonance, if you will, with my dad's side of the family. I mean, I love these guys. They were fantastic. But yeah, they went to church, and in some cases they were awfully conservative. And in their older years, some of them have become Trump supporters. And, and part of that sort of Texas Christian culture, because that's where I grew up, was Texas. Now, my mother's side of the family is from Ukraine initially. And my mother, for example, both sides of her family were from Ukraine and Russia. And they immigrated to the United States. I think it was the late 1800s. And they came as a whole family. In fact, my mother's favorite film of all time is Fiddler on the Roof. And, if you've ever seen that film or that play, you understand what was going on with what was known as the pogroms at that time period in Russia, where the Jews had to escape, to save their lives. And many of them immigrated to the United States and settled and started their lives. And many of them had nothing when they got here, and then they became successful. That's the story of my mother's side of the family. They were entrepreneurial. They did some really amazing things. My mother's grandfather owned a large lumber company and did very well during World War II, as you might imagine. And they were also into, of all things, Pepsi bottling in South America, which they did very well in. And then my mother's father's side of the family, they settled in Brooklyn. I think they started in New Jersey originally after coming over from Russia, and then they went to Brooklyn. And then my grandfather had a stint where he was incredibly dynamic in Manhattan during the 20s. He had graduated from law school, and then he went on to become a broker during the day, and then by night he was a promoter. He and his cousin started the Roxy Theater, which was a very well-known theater in Manhattan. And so my granddad was a showman, and he was always around a lot of people, and he was a great muckety-muck kind of guy, and very charismatic, incredible entrepreneurial spirit. And he ended up, after the Great Depression, after World War II, migrated to Houston, Texas, where he became an oil broker, and he ended up owning his own oil company, which he called Presser Royalty Company. And my grandfather was a huge influence on me, and he was probably the closest person I've ever been to in my life. I remember growing up in Houston, Texas, on Sunday afternoons during the football season. My granddad and I would go to his favorite Jewish butcher, and we would buy loads of pastrami and corned beef sandwiches and fresh rye Jewish bread and mustard and pickles and all sorts of great things. And we just sit around and nosh all day watching football games. And my grandfather had this sort of kind of a George Burns kind of vibe to him. He was kind of a cross between Winston Churchill and George Burns. And we would go out during halftime, and he'd spark up a stogie. He loved to smoke Cubans. In fact, he would take me to these like cool places in Houston behind the scenes where you could buy Cuban cigars, and he was in the oil industry. He's kind of one of those guys, right? And he always had just incredible wisdom about the world. And I had gone to Sunday school growing up, and I ended up getting my bar mitzvah. And I remember getting my bar mitzvah where, when the rabbi gave us all, subjects that we wanted to use as our speech during our bar mitzvah, I chose honesty and integrity. And I had to do all of this research to basically understand Judaism in context to the nature of honesty and integrity and how it's baked in, to Torah and what we learn and everything else. And, I had made the proclamation that, honesty is good for business. Honesty is your relationship with everybody that you, have in your house of worship, in your place of family, place of business, all of those things. And that the more honest and the more integrity that you have, that people can trust you. And so, therefore, this is what God would want, because He would run a functioning society. Because if everybody could trust each other, then the society would flourish. And that was pretty much the construct. And the opposite side of it was that I had this attitude because I had grown up and I had seen, the kind of this sort of strange, sort of, I don't know, intersection between my dad's side of the family and me. And my by the way, my dad was incredibly self-driven. His father passed away when he was young. He put himself through school. He ended up getting a scholarship to Texas A&M University when he had scholarship opportunities to Berkeley. And I know he got accepted to the Naval Academy. And he was just an incredibly ambitious guy because his dad passed away. And so he was a very kind of successful guy by the time I came around. Well, he was on his way. He graduated from Texas Law School, and he was working in the natural gas industry and corporate as a corporate attorney for a large natural gas company. And so my dad never really talked about religion. I think my dad, and I think actually I had one conversation with my dad along these lines many, many years ago, but it was more of like, I was like, did the passing of your dad under the circumstances that led you to having to be kind of so self-sufficient tarnish your idea and your relationship with religion and God? And he said, yeah. He's like, I just have to do things on my own. And my dad, he has that sort of Lutheran streak in him where it's like, from what I've been told of the stories of the farmers from that time period, very, very self-sufficient, very proud. They don't show off. They just work and work and work. And my dad was that kind of guy. And I remember growing up, my dad's work ethic was ridiculous. I mean, he ran so many marathons, and he'd train in between, going to work all day. And he was like this, full-on executive, and he got flown all over the place, in private jets because he was really good at what he did. And, one thing led to another. And as I'm growing up, this is sort of my matrix, right? This is who I am. But when you're young, you don't choose what your religion is. You're put into a situation where your parents choose your relation to God, or, what your religion is. And in my case, I was always told that if your mom's Jewish, you're Jewish. And then later on in life, I became a little bit more cynical to that. But I can tell you, after years and years and years of like looking into certain things and understanding history, which I became incredibly obsessed with, and understanding the nature of power, which I also became incredibly obsessed with, I chose to be Jewish, not just culturally Jewish, and I didn't do it just for the jokes and Larry David and pastrami and that sort of thing. I did it because I believe in the story of Moses, the story of, coming together to fight, if the feudal state, I guess, a slave state, because we can't be slaves. And I believe in liberty and justice and Exodus. And that was my whole primer on religion. And so, growing up, of course, if you're Jewish, I grew up in basically about as waspish a neighborhood as you can imagine. In fact, I found out later that Jews weren't allowed in the neighborhood I grew up in Texas, 20 years before, right? So I always had a chip on my shoulder. I was like, you know what, I'm Jewish. That's all there is to it. I'm not going to be intimidated by anybody else. And really, all of my friends in Texas that I grew up I was lucky. I was very accepted. And I had some really terrific friends. And they were, let me tell you, they were definitely part of the, I don't know, white bourgeois, if you will. Most of their parents were all professionals that came out of University of Texas, and their parents, like my parents, were either engineers or attorneys. There was a lot of judges in my neighborhood, and so I grew up around the educated. And I guess at that time we'd say the upwardly mobile. And they were my best friends, and they were beautiful people. And they came to my bar mitzvah, and I've been friends with them ever since. In fact, we were all huge Kiss fans. The band Kiss, and we used to dress up as Kiss in our neighborhood and rock out the neighborhood. And it was years later I found out that I'm pretty sure Paul Stanley is Jewish. I know Gene Simmons is, and I'm not sure Ace Frehley and Peter Criss weren't. But I mean, that was kind of like, okay, so Jews rocks. And of course, I found out later about Frank Zappa and many others. Whatever, And I grew up with this sort of thing where it's just like, okay, I had this relationship with Israel, like most Jews do. And as I grew up, most of the professional Jews were Reform. There were people that worked, doctors and attorneys and that sort of thing, and they're very smart and they were Reform. So they didn't really have religion on their shoulder. And since I was born in 1968, this This was like literally what 23 years after Adolf Hitler committed suicide, as the Red Army was enclosing and everything that came with, the Holocaust and all of the tragic insanity that surrounded that. And so, I grew up going to synagogue, and I'll never forget my grandfather, you know, who I just adored. And he would sit there as they played Kol Nidre, and he would weep. And I was just so emotionally connected to that. And I got to tell you, I grew up just despising hatred and fascism above all else. And I grew up with this mentality of never again. Never again will Jews be put on trains and led to the slaughter in gas houses. And I remember reading something in my fraternity, like they were hazing Jewish students at this fraternity that was nearby me, where they said they made Jewish students say, 6 million, and I should have been one of them. And I thought to myself, if I ever meet these guys that did that, I'm going to beat the ever living hell out of them. And I was ashamed of the Jewish guys that did it to belong in a fraternity like that. I couldn't believe it, right? That wasn't me. Anyway, but at the same time, I wasn't completely, as some might interpret, I didn't go to shul every Friday night. I wasn't Orthodox. I wasn't somebody who didn't, eat kosher. I didn't, eventually, like if you go up the ladder of conservative and then Orthodox and then what they call Hasid, there's different, sectors of Judaism that, these guys are committed. And they run a very, very, very tight household in terms of their commitment to Judaism, which is part of it, right? And I was definitely not that guy. I was, somebody who liked, I don't know, comedy and rock and roll and partying down and, doing my thing. So I was a lot more, I guess, culturally absorbed in, the time period that I grew up in. And then as I got older and more mature and less of a chip on my shoulder, I was less like, I'll tell you a quick story about well, let's just put it this way. I didn't tolerate swastikas in my presence. And now I'm kind of like, whatever, prison gangs and white supremacists aren't necessarily the same type of Nazis that I think, were the brown shirts and the Nazis that created the Holocaust. Not saying that they wouldn't be if they got the chance, but a lot of these guys in the last 20, 30 years, especially in prison, you have all of these gangs in prison. And so the white gangs ended up becoming these guys that were white supremacists. And, they're really no different than all of the other gangs. And they're all involved with drug dealing and manner of shape, form of all sorts of violence and, really terrifying stuff. But at the same time, I don't know, they never really rose to the point of being able to turn everybody in the country into a Nazi, right? And so I never really considered it a ginormous threat, although it was plenty of threat. So that's kind of background. Now, as we unpack what's been going on with anti-Semitism, I'm going to kind of qualify this as the last 20 years. All right. So Israel itself, to me, in my world, was always a democracy. I understood, the plight of the Jews escaping Nazi Germany. I was quite aware, and of course more now than ever before, of what wasn't welcoming in the United States, particularly under the FDR administration, and Jews who were trying to escape, the Holocaust they had no choices, and so many of them headed towards the Promised Land, right? And there used to be a saying within Zionists, next year in Jerusalem, right, for a very long time. And prior to the Holocaust, of course, there was anti-Semitism throughout Europe, for example, and really the world, and Russia particularly, and what they called pogroms for over, like, I guess, 1,000 years, literally. I mean, I guess if you go back to the time of antiquity and Jesus Christ and the Romans, and then, obviously the crucifixion of Jesus, and then 500 years later, with all of that history in between, that Christianity through the Council of Nicaea became, the state religion of the Roman Empire, right? And so after that happened, after the Christians were crucified and, dealt with in the Colosseum and the lions and all of that kind of stuff, and, and all of the intricacies that led to that, and I can't remember the emperor's name who actually, and I'm a little bit embarrassed to say that I can't remember his name at the moment, but and his wife's influence and things of that nature. But yes, Christianity becomes, the Holy Roman Empire. It evolves over, incredible amount of time. And then we ended up with what? The Inquisition, and we had pogroms in Russia. And so Jews, throughout all of these time periods, it experienced all sorts of anti-Semitism and hatred, and which over eons forced Jews into compact communities where, in some cases they were called the ghettos, and eventually they became the ghettos in, of course, Western Europe during the age of the Third Reich. But this was long before that, and in so doing, the Jews really, kept the flame and kept Judaism alive and always stayed true to the tenets of Judaism. And it's a miracle, given all of the challenges that they faced, that they survived as long as they had against, really, I mean, it was just a murderous wrath for so long, unbelievable amount of time. And so when you grow up with that knowledge, you hold true to, at least a commitment, um, especially through my upbringing and my love for my grandfather and my mother, and my mother's side of the family. But the just for my free will, it really all came circling back to, my notion of Exodus and liberty, and quite frankly, the law, because that's what that whole story is about. And you get into Leviticus, and you get into Deuteronomy, and you get into the laws of the way things work to get into Israel, and then ultimately what Israel's society was constructed upon, which of course no pharaoh or king is supposedly, presumably, above the law. Now, in the eyes of the Zionist, for example, was Israel supposed to be a Jewish state? Oh yeah. Well, given from where they came from, you could understand why. And then, well, maybe you can't understand why, because there's a lot of people who are Palestinians and other people that have lived in that area for all the time that the Jews weren't there, that it then became their land, right? And so then you have, the incredible conflict ever since Israel was founded. And the notion of Israel as a democracy comes initially from the evolution of, obviously, Exodus, right, to the promised land, based on all of these laws and so forth. And that, no person is above the law. It's God's law, right? But at the same time, it's the level of, I don't know, ethics. Everybody shall function in the society based, I guess, on common sense with consequences. And, again, I'm just kind of throwing things out there just in terms of very surface stuff, because, as I grew up, man, I'm about as liberal and free as they get. I love punk rock, whatever, man. I just, and who I am. So I wasn't completely focused on the religion, never was, right? Except from the kind of point of view that I had mentioned, but most notably because I can't stand fascism and I can't stand hatred. And that goes for everybody. I can't stand hatred or fascism for anyone. And so now, over the course of, let's talk about this political cycle first, and then I'm going to kind of circle back to the last 20 years in Israel. But leading into that, yesterday, for example, and I think over the course of the last couple of weeks, I've seen unbelievable pictures from Israel of tens of thousands of Israelis coming to the streets to protest Netanyahu's, autocratic sort of maneuverings to be able to have his party choose the Supreme Court judges, and probably all the judiciary from that point forward in Israel, which I'm not as familiar with their setup as ours. But, people are protesting for separation of powers and the independence of the judiciary. Primarily, I believe, based on this premise of Exodus, which is liberty that leads to the integrity of law. I mean, that's the way I'm interpreting it, and that's what I'm seeing on the streets. Meanwhile, what I know in my work is that we have a corrupt judiciary in the United States that's enormous. Many of you are now becoming a little bit more aware of the corruption that's been taking place in the Supreme Court. But I can assure you it's much, much more than that. And as I've said in some of these truth bombs recently regarding, Donald Trump, the United States versus Donald Trump in West Palm Beach, where Judge Eileen Cannon is presiding, and Lawrence Tribe, who's a Harvard professor who's frequently on the national stage, who actually was a professor to Merrick Garland, our Attorney General, is saying that there could be criminal fraud exception scenarios because of the Jack Smith investigation, where lawyers are lying in court for their client, and judges are working in conjunction, in cahoots with what in this particular case would be the party, probably, right, and the influence of Trump and that sort of thing. So here's an established sort of pathway that's impugning the integrity of the court. Meanwhile, I have a very close friend and associate who is also Jewish, by the way, who is fighting like crazy for the most vulnerable, particularly women of color, who got set up in a massive Ponzi scheme, predatory lending scenario that is now stealing people's houses, these women's houses, many of whom are widows who've always paid for their mortgages, who are getting bulldozed using illegal documentation fabrication, which I continue to illustrate as part and parcel and reflective and refractive of all things Trump and what's going on in all of his investigations. But meanwhile, everybody's ignoring what happened to tens of millions of people along these lines of what I'm saying. And so we don't have tens of millions of people coming to the streets saying, "Are you kidding me? The Supreme Court's working for corrupt corporations?" Oh yeah, they are. And so why aren't there millions of us doing what they're doing in Israel right now? Okay? Well, let me bring that, and what's that have to do with anti-Semitism as sort of kind of a primer for this whole dialogue? Well, look, again, Bruce and I are both Jews, okay? And we're fighting for liberty and justice. Let me tell you that. And for freedom and for the integrity of law, okay? So if you're anti Semitic and you hate me as a Jew that's doing that, then you're anti American, as far as I'm concerned. And you're anti freedom and liberty and justice for all, which makes you possibly a Nazi, which I always come back to knowing what I know about the work that I've done in www.thecon.tv, that the entirety of our financial system created the largest racketeering enterprise that emanated from the CEOs, which we call control fraud, through a psychological device called Gresham's dynamic that control the maneuverings of incentives for employees to lie, steal, and cheat to be able to set people up in a whole system that was smoke and mirrors, that ultimately blew up the world and had tens of millions of people that got crushed, set up, destroyed based on a lie. Now, many of those people have become MAGA. A lot of those people are white working class people who lost their job, have to work too many jobs, they can't afford the mortgage, they lost their mortgage, and they're just pissed, and they're fucking pissed at, quite frankly, what they look as the problem, which are the Democrats, okay? And so they skewed towards MAGA. I'm pretty convinced, in fact, I know for a fact, that not all MAGAs are Nazis. There's a lot of MAGAs that are, just regular white people that are just fed up with the corrupt system. And so they're like, okay, well, all of the other white people are going towards Trump, and Trump's not the system. I mean, that's what happened in 2016. What happened in 2020 is something slightly different, and what we're in the midst of right now is something worse and more problematic, especially as it relates to anti-Semitism. Because what's insane to me, given everything that I've just told you, first and foremost, there is a lot of cohesion, okay, between the state of Israel and right-wing causes. And now, quite frankly, the religious theocracy of Saudi Arabia, okay, led by the Netanyahu government. Now, as I mentioned, 10 minutes ago, when I grew up, Israel was this sort of, island of democracy in a land of religious theocracy in Islamicism, right? And that was always my perspective growing up in the 70s and the 80s, and especially the oil wars, and of course the Six-Day War and the 1973 war, and knowing what I know about Jews and Israel and Exodus to next year in Jerusalem and all those types of things. And, in fact, when I grew up, we were always planting trees in Israel. And the idea was that, here is this industrious group of people that are going to go build these causeways. They're going to make, agriculture flourish in the desert, and they're going to build, this oasis. And many Israelis, quite frankly, did. Okay. Now, there's a lot of other things we can talk about in terms of right of return and two-state solution and all of these other things that are specific to the geopolicy of everything that's been going on in that neighborhood for a very long time. But I want to focus primarily on this right movement by this authoritarian sect led by Netanyahu, which is just actually operating for what was the big funding mechanism from Sheldon Adelson and I'm sure many others. Now, over the course of time, we've seen this sort of adherence, if you will. Let me hit the rewind button just briefly to what was known as the Intifada, which was taking place in the 90s, between the Palestinians and the PLO, after the two-state solution wasn't going any further, and they kept, negotiating and giving land back and so on and so forth. It ultimately, and I'm cutting through some very complicated stuff and some very precision stuff, and there was definitely give and take, and there was definitely good and bad actors, and sometimes the good actors did bad things and vice versa on both sides. I can tell you Yasser Arafat was pocketing everything the European Union was giving to him while starving the population of Palestinians. So he was no friend to the Palestinians, although he was like the figurehead of being able to create this two-state solution. And his wife was shopping in Paris like you wouldn't believe. This undergirded all of the stuff that was going on with this crazy sort of insane warfare in the late 90s, early 2000s, including, homicide bombers that go on buses with these belts with all the shrapnel where they could just destroy as many people and make as many people suffer as they possibly could, which is terror. And a lot of this was funded and led by Hamas and it'll come to me in a minute, some of the other players that are involved. It's been a hornet's nest the whole time. And the Israelis have always been, look, never again. We're going to fight to the death to be able to survive because we've seen the gas chambers. We've had 1,000 years of anti-Semitism. We understand what happens when we don't fight for our survival. And the Jews became, or the Israelis, I should say, because I don't think, quite frankly, the Orthodox and the super Hasid ever was a part of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force. I think a lot of these guys were like, they do their religion, they pontificate, not pontificate, but they read between the lines, they debate, they're scholars. And that's another part of this whole equation that I probably should insert at this point. Jews, considering how small the population is throughout the world because of everything that came before, also have a giant influence in a lot of professional arenas. Because Jews, by culture, study Talmud and debate and are smart, and their culture is smart. And so the Jews and I don't want to do a broad brush, but there are certain cultures that really, maintain incredible academic discipline. And Jews tend to have a lot of, by percentage, professionals, whether they're doctors, whether they're scientists, whether they're engineers, whether they're this or that. And that's one side of the equation. And so you remember when I mentioned, when the Israeli settlers, were able to create the opportunity for irrigation and, trees to bloom in the desert sort of thing. I mean, it was that sort of innovation and that sort of stick-to-itiveness that created what would ultimately become what we're seeing now, just incredible technology coming out of Israel, okay? But that being said, also, there's been this move to the right really since 9/11, and undergirded by this billionaire sort of settler sort of initiative that corresponded to this sort of, collaboration between evangelicals and Israelis, okay? Which, of course, if you know the history, is incredible. Let's hit the quick rewind button to antiquity and Jesus. You all know that Jesus was Jewish, right? He was a rabbi. And historical Jesus seemed to have been, from what I've read, very committed to the notion of rooting out oppressive corruption. And from what I understand, as oh God, what is the biblical term for, as he's going around and preaching and so on and so forth, a lot of it had to do with, of course, helping the poor. And you're not going to get into the kingdom of heaven. I'm throwing some stuff in, probably based on memes, so don't quote me on biblical text. But the idea that he couldn't stand the sort of intricacies of polluting, we all know, the temple for the sacredness of a place of spirituality, presumably, so that all were welcome. And yet the money changers, could manipulate, could exploit, and there's going to be a poor factor in the sector, and there's going to be the priesthood that has, the power and that sort of thing. That's what he was rebelling against. And from what I understand, of course, through Roman history and everything that took place at that time, he ends up becoming a threat. And I'm interpreting it through a lot of cultural sort of references and everything else. Again, I'm not a biblical scholar, so please don't quote me on all of this. But eventually, of course, he's crucified. There's, historical Jesus. There's obviously religious context Jesus, the different variations of Jesus, and so on and so forth. And of course, the evolution that I touched upon earlier, that 500 years later, it's when it becomes the state religion. But ironically, in the name of Jesus and Christianity, we saw corruption bloom throughout, the Dark Ages. And therein lies the schisms, right? So then you had the Protestants, and you had the Lutherans, and then you had the Methodists, and all of these different splinter groups after, thousand years of basically tension and fights over, the spirituality or the sanctity of the idea and the faith versus the practicality of how things work in society with money and so forth. So it was like the same story over and over and over. And as this is all happening, Jews end up, becoming the brunt of a lot of it as Christianity's morphing, and ultimately, which leads to this sort of, this incredible poison and this disease throughout history called anti-Semitism. And that led us to this modern era, which now all sorts of strange things are going on between, of course, like I've mentioned, post 9/11, that this far right movement in Israel that is connected to obviously Christian evangelicals and everything that constitutes, especially in the power matrix. In fact, I listen to Chris Hedges a lot, and Chris Hedges talks about Christofascism, which is part of this whole thing as well, right? And anyway, so you get to all of these sorts of, let's call them memes or blood libel, or this perception that Jews are ruling the world through finance and banking and media and all of these different types of things, and they eventually, through this sort of historical setting. Now, when you go back to Middle Ages, Jews were, because they were intelligent, because they were good at finance, they ended up becoming basically the guys that ran the kingdoms, and then ultimately finance, and then ultimately they were set up and doomed. I mean, that's kind of the history of Europe as it relates to Judaism, okay? But the knowledge of finance and medicine and science and everything else continued to, continued to grow and thrive with Jews, no matter all of the challenges that they were up against. And then you wind up in this modern era where we've got this incredible, unfortunate reality. Okay? So whether or not Robert F. Kennedy has some anti-Semitic inclinations, which he might, I don't know he doesn't. The more I've seen, the more I kind of question it based on some pretty compelling things. But I need to look more, okay? But at the same time, I'm very well aware that there's a lot of people on the left and the far left who think Israel and Jews are just as much the problem as the far right does. And the far left, which I always found interesting, right? Okay, well, you can't trust the capitalist Jew pigs. They're the financiers. They're this, they're that. They're the problem. Meanwhile, most of them are Marxists. And of course, Karl Marx was Jewish. Okay, so there's that. But it was just fascinating, among other things. But, Jews are smart and intellectual, but they're like everybody else. There's good Jews, there's bad Jews. There's good blacks, there's bad blacks. There's good women, there's bad women. It doesn't matter. Everybody, like I've always found on my journey, and this is where I came to conclude when I first started off, going down the pathway of making the con, that there's two columns of our soul. You've got character and integrity versus hypocrisy, duplicity, and complicity. And depending on the situation, your soul's going to skew to one pole or the other, depending on what the pressure is. Only the righteous can grind through the pressures of complicity, because ultimately, this is what I'm trying to get to in terms of the conversation, right? So as a Jew who hates fascism and hatred above all else, in all its forms, doesn't matter if it's coming from the left or the right, I hate it. I can't stand any sort of blind hatred. It's just a tool of the vicious to control, and I've always been anti that. So that makes me an anti-fascist. And after everything I've learned, I know that corruption births and fuels fascism. We're seeing it all over the fucking place. And now it's becoming this tool that could be wielded, and it could be like, in some cases it's like, what's the word I'm looking for? When it's so like, you can't talk about it, taboo, right? You can't talk about anti-Semitism sometimes and really calling a spade because of all of these things that have happened throughout history. So for example, when people talk about, well, the Jews run the media. Yeah, I think proportionally there's a lot of Jews who've gotten to the top of media because they created media. It was the Jews that created Hollywood. They were the inventors who created Hollywood. The Warner Brothers and others that were in that part, and they created the studio system, and they're entrepreneurs, and so they know how to make money. Yeah, and when they got the chance to do it after they got under the thumb of all of this bullshit in Europe, they took a chance and they went for it, and they made incredibly more amazing situations take place. They were incredible. But again, when that happens and when you start making a lot of money, sometimes you start making really bad decisions. Sometimes you get overwhelmed by greed. There's no question. Does that make all Jews greedy? I'm not greedy. I'm not rich enough to be greedy. Never would be greedy anyway because I know what the history is and I know what it meant to me and my DNA and everything that I stand for. I can't stand the idea of being greedy. I can't stand to be underhanded. But let me tell you something. As a Jew, and I mentioned this to you about me and Bruce trying to end all of this stuff in the courts that we know is complete corruption in context to obviously, Exodus and liberty and justice. I mean, that's really the basis of it all. I can tell you that there's so many Jews that I've encountered in the law that have fought valiantly like you would not believe to prevent everything that I wound up finding out to be truth. Now, on the opposite side of that, yeah, there's a lot of Jews in media, again, presidents of networks like Jeff Zucker at CNN, alongside, I'm not sure if Les Moonves is Jewish, but I believe he is. They both made a calculated decision that it was good for ratings to have Trump, in the campaign because it kind of shook things up and it was great for advertising. That's a cynically fucked up way to look at things, considering where we are now with MAGA and a far-right movement and everything that's happened since Charlottesville forward. Insane. I would say that to them every time. I'd be like, shame on you, you freaking idiots. How stupid can you be? And I'll say this about those that are in finance and also the legal profession who backstop finance and let them get away with everything that we're dealing with. Yes, some of the top guys at the biggest financial institutions of the country, as well as the regulators and inside government and through the revolving door. People like Robert Rubin, former CEO of Goldman Sachs, turned Secretary of the Treasury under the Clinton administration. He's very, very culpable to blame for the 2008 great financial crisis and so much more. Also, Larry Levitt. He was head of the SEC at the time. Arthur Levitt, not Larry Levitt. Arthur Levitt, Jewish. He's at the SEC. He was part of the president's working group during Clinton that got rid of Glass-Steagall and regulations. That led to the destruction of the world. Okay? Same with, probably above all else, Alan Greenspan. Alan Greenspan was the chairman of the Federal Reserve. It was because of what he did with lowering interest rates to nearly zero and then broadening the credit bubble, and then also having all of the information about predatory lending that would go on to blow up millions of people and destroy their lives viciously, using the power of the courts to ultimately do it to the most vulnerable. Yeah, he was knowledgeable and aware of everything that he did. There was another well-known Jewish person, a guy by the name of Roland Arnault, who was CEO of a company called AmeriQuest. Roland Arnault was a victim of the Holocaust, who came to the United States, built up this huge real estate empire, and then wound up using liar's loans to deceive people left and right, while giving money, by the way, to the Holocaust Museum. I know that he was one of the biggest contributors. And this guy single-handedly was responsible for destroying the lives of millions of people through deceptive acts and practices in the con and all sorts of stuff that people like, Nazis accuse Jews of doing by being in power and manipulating, destroying people. Yeah, they did that. They did that. And it's disgusting and it's shameful and it's horrific and it's, but, who's talking about that? I am. And I'll also say, being a Jew, that they didn't make those decisions because they were Jewish. They made those decisions because they're greedy fucking asshole pigs. Okay? Look around, man. President Obama is not this archangel, okay? President Obama knew exactly what Wall Street got away with, and he let them get away with it. As an African American, and 60% of African American household wealth evaporated, got destroyed through predatory lending, through the courts that bulldoze all manner, shapes, or sizes of academic and the amount of money that people made, and destroyed African Americans and what their gains were after Jim Crow and redlining. He let them. He betrayed he betrayed Black America. So too did, of all people, Eric Holder, the only African American Attorney General of the Department of Justice. He let all of Wall Street get away with this. And thank God, all of Wall Street wasn't just Jews. I think percentage-wise, there was a high percentage of Jews, but there was also Jamie Dimon, who's like one of the worst actors there are. To my knowledge, he's not Jewish. I don't think even remotely close. I think he's Greek for some reason. I don't know what his background is, to be honest with you. And there are others. But then, of course, you look around and you see like what Epstein and this guy Wexler and this other guy Leon Black, right? He's a hedge fund guy, and Stephen Cohen and all these other guys. Look, I'm telling you that they are as bad as it gets. They're horrific people. They're horrible people. They've used and they've gotten away with all sorts of manipulation that's illegal, where most of these guys should be in prison, quite frankly, have all of their money and their gains taken back and ripped back, and we should nationalize the banks and all sorts of stuff as a result of racketeering that we prove in the con at www.thecon.tv. And they should be ashamed of themselves. And quite frankly, I think they should be tarred and feathered. I don't mean that literally, but what I'm saying is they just need to be outed. We need to have a real honest dialogue about, there are flaws in every direction, because what I can't stand above all else are people that are so fucking guilty that hide behind things like anti-Semitism, like we can't talk about it because it's taboo and all of those other things. Meanwhile, they're raping the world left and right. And they're not the only ones, right? They're heavily involved with Saudi Arabia, religious theocracy. To all of these guys, the only God that matters, honestly, is money. And then when you realize that money and fiat currency and how it can be created, the manipulation of everything else. Look, I grew up with a bunch of Jewish guys sometimes that were really good at gambling. They really knew, and they were smart, and they could definitely leverage stuff like crazy. It's a natural thing, not because they're Jewish, but because it's like we like baseball, we like football, we like to gamble, we like to do things, and we were smart. It was a kind of a cultural thing, just like black dudes have their thing and whatever. We all have a cultural thing. What I'm trying to demystify and what I'm trying to break through, and I'm going to bring it full circle to what makes me Jewish and ultimately what I'm seeing in Israel that makes me incredibly proud. And I hope that somehow here in the United States, we can all come together. I'm trying to create exodus from corruption. And then I'm trying to create the resurrection of the American dream. And the only way you can do that is to defeat and to triumph and to crush corruption and the fascism that it births. And of all people, the Jews should know this above all else. And many of them do. But I would ask you, in your analysis of all of this stuff, as confusing as it may sound, to understand everybody is capable of being evil. Everybody. Evil is the problem. Cowardice is the problem. Criminal is the problem. Like some of my favorite people in the world are African Americans, right? And they came up through really tough circumstances and everything else to become champions. Like I could go on and on. I mean, I love Muhammad Ali. I love Jimi Hendrix. I love Earl Campbell. I love Cam Chancellor. I love Mike Tyson. I mean, Marshawn Lynch. I mean, these guys, I don't even think of them as African Americans. I think of them as just incredible human beings. Okay? And so, and then do I know that there's really bad thugs in the Western Sudan and places throughout Africa that are like terrorists? Yeah. Do I target them and say they're black and they should be destroyed like, some sort of like canard out of an Indiana Jones film, the first one, right? You remember when the Nazis are looking at, the pirates in off the coast of the Mediterranean, somewhere in the Mediterranean, they're like, these guys, you're dogs and you're animals and whatever, you're lesser than, right? We're all human beings. What matters is the system of integrity. What matters is the system of honesty. What matters is the system of common sense and the ability to work together to A, compromise, but B, have a vision of a society that we all can thrive in, and then ultimately hold bad actors to account. What happens is when you have all of these deviations and all of these perversions, you end up with disaster. And a lot of innocent people get destroyed as a result of it. So that's my 2 cents on anti-Semitism. Hatred will always be there. The best way to deal with all of these problems is to have a system with integrity. Problem solved. So much more. There's so much more. But whatever. Look, we got to come together. I'm trying to create a tidal wave resurgence, a tidal wave populist crusade to purge corruption. If you, me, and everybody you see who isn't a Nazi, who believes in and champions dignity and decency and dignity or integrity and beauty and sustainability above all else, and we come together and merge in unity, we will defeat the misery of tyranny. Failure is not an option. Rise, roar, revolt, onwards and upwards. And by the way, I didn't part the Red Sea and I don't walk on water, but I know the truth.